Welcome, everyone. My name is Don Schiefelbein, along with my father, 7 brothers, their wives, 4 nephews, and all the children collectively. There's about 88 of us. Operate Schiefelbein Farms, our large diversified farming operation in Kimball, Minnesota. I also serve as a volunteer leadership role as the vice president of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Tonight, we are taking a break from our series that has been focusing on soils, forages, and grazing to bring you a webinar to discuss a topic that is becoming a topic of concern across our agricultural community, mental health. And on a very personal note, 28 years ago yesterday, my brother succumbed to the pressures of farming and committed suicide. As a participant, your line will be muted, but feel free to type in questions in the question box on your screen during the webinar, and at the end of the presentations, we will get to as many of those as time will allow. If you have trouble with your technology, or if you are joining us only for the audio, the webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing in a few days at ncba.org. Just look for the producer tab on the website. The webinar tonight, titled When Stress is More Than a Season, features Ted Matthews, who is the Director of Minnesota Rural Mental Health and is based out of Hutchinson, Minnesota, who, by the way, is just down the road from us. He has been serving as a mental health practitioner with over 30 years of experience in counseling in rural areas. Joining Ted is Adrian DeSuter. Adrian is a behavioral health consultant and agriculture wellness advocate, partnering with both ag and general community organizations to combat farmer suicide and provide education on farmer wellness. To view Ted's and Adrian's full bios, please see the webinar homepage at ncba.org. Now let's get started with tonight's webinar. Adrian, I will hand it off to you to get us started.
Thank you so much, Don. I really appreciate you inviting us to be here, and I appreciate your personal story that you shared with us, because mental health is not a conversation that is easy to have in the agricultural world. But we're here today to try to make that conversation a little bit easier. So my name is Adrian DeSutter. I am a former school counselor, actually, and about 8.5 years ago, I found a man who later became my husband, Farmer Drew, and they say when you marry the farmer, you marry the farm, which is very much the case with us. So with a mental health background, I was kind of looking for ways to become more involved in our livelihood of farming. Since we're in Illinois, we're farmers rather than ranchers. But when I heard about a lot of the mental health concerns and statistics that were happening in agriculture, I knew that this was something I needed to advocate for. So I actually came across Ted Matthews in just some research that I was doing. So I'm going to let Ted introduce himself, and we'll get rolling.
Hi, as you said, I'm Ted Matthews. I have been doing this for a very long time. I started in 1993. I worked for FEMA. And in working for FEMA, after about a year, we never had any calls from farmers. And a farm business management instructor called me and asked me if we worked with farms. And I looked on our sheets and never had anyone called. So we found out that farmers don't call psychologists. So in knowing that, we decided that we better find a way to be able to communicate with them. So the program basically started with the concept of, I don't have my credentials on the walls. I have them, I just don't have them on the wall. And it's because farmers, when they call Ted. Let's call Ted. He knows more about this than I do. And then that's what I constantly tell people to identify. So yes, I've been in tons of magazines and television and everything else, and it's all with concerns about mental health with farmers. And I think maybe we should just start off by identifying the concept of mental health. Far too often when we hear mental health, we think mental illness. And why that is so important to look at is, if I say I'm not mentally ill, then I don't need to do anything. I can still handle it. The problem is mental health means just that, mental health. Why wouldn't anyone want to be healthier? Why wouldn't anyone want to be happier? Happiest person alive should say, I would like to be even happier than that. So focusing on mental health means getting healthier, feeling better than you do. And mental illness is something entirely different. So when we look at mental health, we need to look at how can we be healthier and how can we prevent ourselves from getting to the point where it does become mental illness, where it goes too far. And the problem all of us have is we never know how far too far is, ever. And we find that out when we go too far. So be aware of that and understand that keeping our stress, anxiety, and depression lower is really important, because if we don't, bad things happen.
So we're going to just start talking a little bit about stressors in agriculture. And, as Ted said, we're not just talking about mental health conditions like depression or anxiety. We're talking about the things that create stress for us. Because the fact of the matter is, farming and ranching is one of the most stressful occupations. It's also one of the most beautiful and the most rewarding, right? But it's also stressful. Those things are not exclusive. We can, as farmers and ranchers, we can be tough, but farming and ranching can also be tough. And so we kind of want to go over a little bit of what that looks like. You know it as well as we do that this is a difficult industry, and people handle it all. Everyone handles it in their own way and in a different way. But some of the things that people have talked about and that farmers have reported feeling stressed about are the very obvious financial and business problems and issues, and fear of losing the farm. I know I've heard Ted say this before, and this is something that really resonates with me, that farming is much more than an occupation. It's a lifestyle, it's an identity. And so when you have that concern that you're no longer able, you may no longer be able to farm because of your profitability, that causes a lot of stress. I actually know of a gentleman who died by suicide a few years ago. And for him, his family said he was always talking about being worried about finances. That was always something that concerned him and stressed him out. And after he died, they said the thing is, we didn't actually have any financial problems. It was just that he was so worried about it and didn't know what he was going to do if he lost it, that, there was just so much pressure built up. So I think even though farmers and ranchers are willing to, acknowledge that there are definitely some real financial constraints, there's also just that perception and that worry that there could be some that makes things kind of tough. And we know that every occupation has its stressors. I was a counselor, Ted's a therapist. We know that in our jobs there are, things that definitely take a toll on us and weigh on us. But I think one of the biggest differences about agriculture is that there's so much out of your control. There's weather, there's disease in livestock and in crops. There's breakdowns that happen that really throw off your entire day. So there's all these things that are happening. Obviously trade wars, obviously prices, things that just are really beyond our control. And they're not just beyond our control, they're things that could make or break your entire operation if they go the wrong way. So there's just a lot of pressure, I think, that it kind of builds up, and because of that, we see stress on the farm. Then we see stress at home because there's not a big separation between your work life and your home life. We're out working long hours, and it turns into family stress then, and relationship stress, and I know a guy who says his hardest part about being a farmer is not the busy planting season or the harvest season. It's when those things are over and he has to adjust back into being a husband and a dad and the routine of the home. So I think there's just a lot that goes on in agriculture, and I'm going to let Ted talk a little bit more about these.
Well, one of the things that farmers really don't look at, because most of them go through it, is when don't they have stress? You know, you have to get your operating loan. So to get your operating loan, you have to prepare. You have to get your books ready, and you go to the bank and you hope that you can get your operating loan. And if you do, and hopefully you will, then you have to plant. And like last year, not an unusual year, we waited and waited and waited, and everybody was panicked that they wouldn't be able to get the crop in. And then you go through the stress of planting, and then is it going to be too wet? Is it going to be too dry? Is it going to be too hot? Are they going to have aphids? When do you spray? Will you spray too soon? Do you spray too late? And then you go through that whole process, the whole summer, hoping for the best, and you get to the time to bring in the crop, and then what's the moisture in the corn going to be? I mean, in northwestern Minnesota, there's still thousands of acres left out there because the moisture was too high, and you can't make any money if you don't have your own dryer with as high as the moisture count was up there. So you go through that stress, and you get through all of that, and at the end you look and you say, okay, I made some money this year, or I didn't, and now I've got to go through that process again, and it starts all over again. So when is it that farmers aren't stressed? So you're always stressed. It's not a matter of are you, it's a matter of what do you do with it? How do you handle your stress? And as was said already, we never know how much stress we can handle. We don't know how much stress other people in our family can handle. But one thing we do know is with farming, it's not like other occupations. If 50 years ago, if you decided you want to be a farmer and you were willing to do what it took, you could be a farmer. You could start off working in construction and make some money and buy a little land and then buy a little more and buy a little more. Now it is not possible. When you're out, you're out. If you're a plumber and you lose your business, you can work for another plumber and after a while get back on your feet and open your own plumbing business again. If you're a farmer, with the cost of land and the equipment, there is no way if you're out you can get back in. So that's a really scary factor, and that's a factor that creates a lot of stress and anxiety in people because they know if they're out, they're out. And that's really, really difficult to look at.
Definitely. And I think that there's also some things about farmers and ranchers that make them good at their jobs, like being a risk taker, for example. You know, I mean, you guys know you're putting a lot of money into something that you don't know how it's going to turn out, right? And so there's that risk-taking component. We know that farmers and ranchers are extremely perseverant. I mean, you know, we're going to push and push and push and be out there as long as we need to, whether that's a harvest season or whether that's a calving season or whatever it is. You know what needs to be done, and you're gonna be out there until it's done, no matter what. And there's that self-reliance too. You know, we know that on our farm anyway, if something breaks down, we're gonna try our darndest to fix it ourselves and not ask for help. But those things can become a barrier for acknowledging when it's time to seek help, when it's time to know when we are pushing things too far. And as Ted said, you know, we don't know when that cutoff is going to be if we don't pay attention to it. We don't know where our stress threshold is. So being tough as farmers are and having that stereotype of being tough and pushing through everything can sometimes be a little bit damaging. And that's where that stigma comes in, that whole negative connotation that, you know, if you had high blood pressure, you wouldn't have any problem going to get medicine for it or seeing a doctor and just getting that under control because you know that that's going to damage your physical health. But with our mental health, you know, we're more afraid of that. We're more afraid to seek out help, talk to a therapist, even talk about the things we're worried about with our family. It's just something we're not as comfortable with. So those are just some of the things that are kind of going on that make agriculture unique. And as a result, we see a lot of challenges in mental health. We see higher levels of stress in farming and ranching. We see higher levels of depression. We see higher levels of substance use. I mean, you know, some cattle here, but we also are predominantly row crop farmers. And I'll tell you what, in the spring, last spring when we couldn't plant and we had all these rain days, it was real easy to say, you know, grab a beer or whatever at night, because you know the next day you're going to wake up and it's still going to be wet out, right? And so that's something, you know, that farmers do to socialize too, and to reduce stress. But there's not always a good control of it, so we start to see higher levels of substance use as well. Farmers actually have the highest levels of stress-related fatalities, meaning, again, blood pressure complications, heart disease, ulcers, things like that. They're the number one for those things. So we know that there's stress. We know that they're causing problems. People are dying. We see work-related fatalities like grain bin accidents and tractor rollovers and things like that, you know, aren't always necessarily due to stress by any means, but we do know there's a little bit of a correlation between when you get stressed out, you maybe act a little more impulsively. You maybe aren't able to, you know, control, concentrate, and make decisions as accurately, because when we're stressed, our brain actually doesn't function the same way. You know, that area in your brain that controls those things and those regulations shrinks. So we definitely see some issues with that. And then we, of course, have heard recently that farmers and ranchers do have some of the highest rates of suicide deaths than any other occupation. And you know, these are numbers, these are all statistics. But I think the biggest statistic is, you know, when I give a presentation on this stuff and I ask the farmers and ranchers and even just the general community, if I say, do you know, raise your hand if you've ever known of a farmer rancher who has died by suicide or someone in a farm family, and almost every single time a hand goes up. And that's pretty telling. You know, that's more than any number or statistic. That's us. This is our friends, this is our loved ones, our neighbors, our community members. You know, this is us. So it's something that we've got to take some control over. So Ted, I don't know if you want to jump on a little bit and talk about what we can do.
Well, before that, I wanted to talk just a bit about what you were talking about earlier about stress and depression. One thing people need to understand is we have to look at our own stress and our own depression as a human being. Human beings are the most complex things in the world. There is nothing more complex than human emotions, nothing. And when we talk about stress and people identify that and they say this is what stress is or this is what depression is, if it's that simple, then why are there 100,000 books written on stress, 100,000 books written on depression? If it's that easy, then why do we have so many identifications for it? And it's because we are different, and we need to understand different isn't bad, different is different. And I need to look at what I'm feeling and understand and accept the fact that I have the right to feel that way, because if I don't, then I'm not going to go to the next step, which is to look at what can I do to feel better.
Right, thanks for that. Yeah, that's a good addition. And that whole concept that, again, we're not talking about, you know, the majority of farmers and ranchers aren't necessarily suffering with depression and aren't having suicidal tendencies. That's not the point here either. The point is we all go through some stress, and we all need to be able to recognize when that stress, you know, is becoming out of our control. So what can we do? Well, here's the deal. Agriculture is a community, right? It doesn't matter if you call yourself a farmer or a rancher, or if you're a row crop farmer, or if you're a cattle rancher. We're all this giant community, and we've seen so many stories of when people you know, are suffering from illness or suffering from injury, and they can't get their crop out, or they can't get cows milked. We see people step up all over the place. We line up to do that and to support each other. And so we've really got to figure out how to do that here. So we're going to talk a little bit about the things we can do individually, and then also, you know, as an agriculture community, what we can be doing for each other. Ted, do you want to jump in?
But when we look at what we can do, what we need to really understand is we have so much negative energy when we're looking at all the things that we can't do, and no one has more amount of energy than they have, than that's inside them. So if I am focused on all the things that are wrong, I don't have the energy to look at what I can do. All I'm looking at is what I can't do. And that can become overwhelming, and I can truly believe that there's nothing I can do. And if I believe there's nothing I can do, there's nothing I can do. So I need to take a step back from that and look at what are my options? What can I do to make it better? Better is not that exciting of a word. We don't like the word better. We want it fixed. We want to know that something has been done, that everything is good, that it's A or it's B. But the truth is, very few things are like that. And in farming, definitely very few things are like that. And we have to look at, what can I do to make it better? And if I focus on what I can do to make it better, my life is going to be as good as it can be, which is a lot better than going in that opposite direction of looking at all the things that are wrong. And we do that with family all the time. You know, when I ask people, what's the most important thing in your life? Everybody always says family. And then I say, okay, what have you done for your family in the last month? And they usually look at me like, what do you mean? So it's important, but their focus is so much on all the things that are wrong and all the things that they can't do and all the things they wish they could do and all the things that are unfair that are being done to them, that they don't focus at all on the positive things. And if you don't focus on the positive things, they don't exist. So you need to look at your family. You need to look at what works for you. Look at your kids, look at your wife and say, if that's the most important thing in my life and I still have them, then everything isn't black, is it? So focus on taking care of yourself. And by doing that, the next part, which is up on your screen right now, be nice. Now, when people hear be nice, they always think be nice to somebody else. Be nice to yourself. If you're nice to yourself, you have the ability to be nice to other people. If you take care of yourself, you have the ability to take care of other people. And you need to really work at that because it's not easy. It sounds like a really easy task. Try it. See how hard it is. We focus on all that stuff that we don't have any control over, and we get angry with ourselves for the things we haven't done and we could have done and we should have done, and we're not nice to ourselves about the things that we do that are positive, that are good, that are healthy, that are helping. And if we don't give ourselves credit for that, it doesn't exist.
Right. And that's just it, is that we forget that without the farmer, there is no farm, right? And without the rancher, the ranch doesn't exist. So all the time we're always worried and stressed out about the things that are happening at work, you know, but we forget that we are the farm's greatest asset. We are what matters to our farm and to ourselves and to our family. I just was, we had a family friend pass away to suicide a couple years ago, and he was a farmer in the area. And, you know, nobody at that visitation was talking about how many acres of land he had or, you know, anything related to his farm, other than the fact that he left it for his wife to handle. You know, what they were talking about is, I can't believe this. He always had a smile on his face, and, you know, who he was as a person, and that he had grandchildren. And so we forget to put value in ourselves. You know, when I have our bank meeting, we write out our list of assets and all those things, again, all that equipment, anything that's worth anything to us. And we forget that we have to include ourselves in that list of worth and in that list of priorities. And so, you know, we raise these thriving crops and these thriving livestock, and we have to make sure that we're raising a thriving farmer and rancher as well. And so again, we do that by, as Ted said, being nice to ourselves and acknowledging that we are worth something and we have value on our farm and in our world, and that maintenance is required. Just like we wouldn't, you know, leave the cattle out to fend for themselves. We're constantly checking in on them. We're constantly checking our equipment. I know right now we've been preparing equipment for planting for a couple months now in our off season. So we're constantly maintaining those things that we consider important. And so we have to do that to ourselves as well. That means, you know, managing stress isn't just, okay, well, I'll take a vacation. Managing stress isn't just, well, I'll go get a massage. And those things are nice and good, so don't get me wrong, we don't want to take those off of our list, but you know, we can't just look at it as we're going to just fix it and check it off the list. Oh, there's my stress management, I'll just get that done. Right? This is something that we have to constantly be paying attention to. We have to constantly know, what are our stressors? What are the things that set me off? You know, what can happen in my day that really throws things off and that makes me stressed out? And then we have to be able to know what those tools are that work for us. We as farmers and ranchers have a plethora of tools. We're wonderful at knowing what our favorite tools are. Maybe not always knowing where they are, but we're good at knowing what they are and what they do for us and how much they help us. And so we have to know what those kind of stress management or wellness or self-care tips are and tricks are that work for us. And I think it all starts with the basics, you know, getting a little bit of exercise and movement and getting sleep, and you know, having hobbies that's outside of work so that we have a little bit of a break. And you know, I don't expect anyone to add 60 minutes of a workout to their day. We already have a busy day, but what can you do to get your blood pumping? Can you know, walk out to the fields when you check them rather than riding a four-wheeler? Can you, you know, do more things by hand and add some movement to your day? And same with eating. You know, I don't expect you to be home for dinner every single night if you have a busy season, but can you have someone swing something out to you to eat so you make sure you're staying nutritionally well as well? And you know, so we all have these different things that work for us. I know something that a lot of farmers have talked about is that concept of gratitude, and gratitude is something that has been, you know, proven to in some people decrease their levels of stress. So you know, whether that's when you're laying in bed at night or when you're driving to work in the morning, just taking time to think of 3 things that happened in your day that you're genuinely grateful for. You know, these are all just random tips. That's just the thing. There's so many tips out there. There's so many tricks out there when it comes to stress management that you have to make an active effort to find what works for you. You know, we can't say, well, this is exactly what you have to do. You have to figure that out, kind of, you know, kind of test things out and figure out what you need at certain times of stress.
Well, and when we were talking about, you know, suicide, I think there's some things that we really need to address there too. When I've worked with people that attempted suicide, and to the person, they always say that they felt like there was just nothing left, and oftentimes they don't think they're in that place until they're there. And one of the things that I like to talk to people about is, you know, isolation is a huge issue with farming, and it's so easy for farmers to become isolated. So I think it's important that they look at, if you see your husband or son or daughter or wife or mother all of a sudden pulling back when that's normally not what they do, be concerned. And if they don't want to talk about that anymore, if that stress level to them is just too high and they just don't want to talk about it anymore, be concerned, because I have heard over and over and over from people who have attempted suicide. They said they thought that the world would be better off without them. They truly believe that. And afterwards, when you talk to them and they come into your office and they luckily survived it, they realize that, you know, how would they feel if their wife committed suicide or their son? Would they say, oh, good, I'm better off? Of course not. So they get into this real negative thinking, and it gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And then one day they, like in the last case that I worked with, go out into the field and slit their wrists. This fellow luckily lived, but that's exactly what he did. And it had nothing to do with money, by the way. It was everything with, it just got deeper and deeper and deeper, and nobody saw the signs. Everybody was concerned about them, but no one did anything. So it's really important that we take a proactive approach with those things. You know, and one of the things that I constantly talk about is if you are concerned that somebody is suicidal and you approach them and you talk to them about that, or you have someone else approach them and talk to them about that, that's as opposed to not doing that. I have also had lots of people tell me, you know, I shoulda. And don't be the one that says I shoulda, be the one that says, what's going on with you? You're obviously stressed, and no matter how they react, no matter how angry they get, you need to keep that focus. And if you're uncomfortable talking to them, have somebody else talk to them, have the clergy talk to them. I also wanted to get a little bit into what is important for me as a psychologist when I'm looking at who I can, you know, what I can do. If there's an attempted suicide 500 miles from here, I can't get there. So I call the sheriff's department. That is my best avenue to get help right away. And so many people, they look at the sheriff's offices as a negative thing. They look at that as that's the person that brings out divorce papers or land disputes or whatever else, all negative. And if you see a sheriff's car in a yard within 20 minutes, everybody within 40 miles knows that somebody was out at that person's farm. Well, for me, they are a godsend, because when I call the sheriff's office, they immediately go out there, and they usually bring that person to the ER right away, and then the hospital has to deal with that, and they go from there. And so I know that even if it's going to take me 5 or 6 hours to get there, or maybe even a day or two, depending on what my schedule looks like, I know that they're going to be safe, and that is a huge factor for me. And so remember, they are there, and they are really helpful, and I can't say enough good things about the sheriff's departments.
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about, Ted, is now what else, what do we do for other people? Because we've kind of talked about, well, what can we do for ourselves? What can we do to manage our own stress? But now let's go into a little bit more of what can we do for other people, because the reality is the people that need help the most are the least likely to ask.
Yep.
And yeah, and that's because of a lot of different factors. But we know that about people with depression or anxiety specifically, that you know, that those who are suicidal in particular have a hard time asking for that help. And so just as, like I said before, just as we show that support as an ag community for other cases of crisis, mental health crises are something we need to take seriously and be a part of as well, and kind of combat together. So we first of all need to know what are some signs of crisis. And again, unfortunately, there isn't a magic formula. There isn't a perfect you know, list. This is something that the National Institute of Mental Health came up with. I didn't include every single one of the things they've listed, but when we're talking about depression, these are some of the things that they typically see. And they can diagnose with depression when there are multiple symptoms, when those symptoms are happening for at least 2 weeks at a time. And we're talking, again, the majority of the days for 2 weeks at a time. And most importantly, I think we see that these symptoms impact your ability to function. You know, on the farm, you may see cattle that are not getting fed, or a farmstead not being well kept up. You may see irritability coming out when you're trying to fix equipment, or, you know, having patience with something that isn't going right. So we're talking about that you're not able to be who you want to be or do the things that you want to do, because some of these signs, these irritability, the fatigue, changes in your sleep or in your eating, these things are getting in the way, essentially. I know a guy who when he's going through a depressive episode, he can't even be around his grandchildren. I mean, he completely loses interest in the things that he typically loves the most. And again, it's not something that you have complete control over, because it's that brain function, again, that is telling you people would be better off without you. It's telling you don't get out of bed because, you're worthless. And so, these signs are important to at least be familiar with, but to acknowledge that really what we want to look for is just the changes in any one person's typical behavior. When you see something or feel something is off, those are kind of what we want to pay attention to acknowledge when crisis is happening. These are some lists, specific to farming. Again, decline in care of crops. I know a farmer in the area who gained a whole lot of weight all of a sudden and stopped shaving all of a sudden. And it wasn't No Shave November, so that doesn't count. But they really lost control of themselves and who they wanted to be, because that depression and anxiety was really becoming overwhelming. So there's lots of things it could be, but again, we want to look for something that has changed from that person's norm, and it could be in the way that they talk, those feelings of hopelessness or worthlessness. It could be in their behavior. So again, that fatigue, seeing withdrawal, seeing substance use increased, isolating, again, as Ted mentioned earlier. It may be in their mood. We may see anger or irritability or rage, extreme mood changes, humiliation. All of those things are things that you could see. But again, it varies for each person. So you just need to remain vigilant, essentially, and really pay attention to what a person's normal behavior is.
And when you're looking at those things, one of the things that you truly also need to remember is, let's say you're concerned about someone and you think you should probably do something, but you're not sure what to do. Well, there's things that you can do now, which is what clergy members are okay with talking about those kinds of things. What social workers, there are people that can help if you're not comfortable talking to that person, and get an idea and call your hotlines and see what do they do. If I call you and I'm concerned about someone, what are you going to do? If you do that, you'll have a much better idea of what they will do. Now, the most important part of what I want to say about that is, let's say you have a friend that didn't come to church for 3 weeks in a row and they never missed church. And so you're really concerned about them. And so you call your clergy and you say, or you talk to your minister and you say, Bob or Cheryl or Mary or Tim didn't come to church for 3 weeks. I'm really concerned about them. And then you go from there and you find out they were in the Bahamas for 3 weeks. That's a little embarrassing. So you're afraid and you think, wow, that's embarrassing. I don't want to do that. So I want you to look at the other side. Let's say they weren't in the Bahamas and they are getting deeper and deeper into their stress, depression, and anxiety. And who knows, they may commit suicide. So when you weigh it, being a little embarrassed if you're wrong is a pretty small thing. So
Absolutely.
Understand that you need to do something, because being a little embarrassed or being right and perhaps saving someone's life and definitely making their life better, no matter what, you're going to make their life better.
Right. And I've had some families who have lost members to suicide, who have reached out to me and said, we get that it's an uncomfortable conversation. We get that. But asking someone, if they're considering suicide, or even just asking if someone's okay, we understand that that's uncomfortable. But you know how uncomfortable it is to be in our shoes right now? We've lost someone. Someone's no longer here. And people won't even say his or her name around us because they're too afraid of what emotions it might set off for us, So we're living lives that are very, very uncomfortable right now. And we ask you to get yourself a little bit uncomfortable for just a little bit and ask those tough questions and show that concern. I pulled up, go ahead.
Well, there's that other side of it too, where if they're not successful and you're a family member and you're on a farm, what are you going to do with that person? I mean, they said they weren't going to kill themselves before and they attempted it. So what do you do with that person? Well, how do you watch them? Who watches them? Nobody can watch them 24 hours a day. So what can you do in that situation? And that's a tough one for a lot of people. And the answer is, if they're working towards getting healthier, that's what you can do. And you can be getting healthier right along with them. Sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. That's okay. That's how these webinars go, right? So this, I just pulled up, we've been talking a little bit about what we can do and how we can reach out once we recognize that we're maybe concerned about someone. So these are the 5 action steps that the National Institute of Mental Health has come up with as far as helping someone in some type of emotional pain. And you see that the number one thing there is ask. We're not waiting. We're not ignoring those signs. We're not hoping that they're going to ask us for help, because again, they probably won't, or there's a good chance that they aren't ready to ask for help. And I've seen a lot of ag mental health conversations saying, well, we need to encourage people to ask for help. And that's great. We want to continue that. But we also want to acknowledge that that's not always going to happen. So what more can we do? And I think, there was a farmer I know who was not showing up to the farm as often as he used to. He was not putting in the same amount of effort, I want to say, as he used to. He was seeming much more tired, didn't want to stick around and talk to the other people on the farm. And so someone reached out to me and said, I'm a little concerned here. And I said, well, you know what you got to do? You got to ask. you got to say that. You got to say, I'm a little concerned here, to them with empathy, and it took a couple of tries, but eventually that farmer unloaded hours and hours in tears of stressors that were piling up inside of him, that he just had never unloaded on anyone, didn't have anyone to talk to about him. So just by simply saying, hey, I noticed there's a change. Is everything okay? And showing that persistent, care, really made a difference for him and really turned things around for him. So, I won't go into all the details on these. The ask is the most important. But then the second thing I want to point out is just that be there, because I think that we get concerned that we're not a doctor or we're not a therapist, or we don't necessarily have the right thing to say. We're worried about saying something the wrong way. And so sometimes that prevents us from having these conversations. And I want to encourage you to remember that it's not your job to give advice. You're not the doctor and the therapist. It's not your job to, work through that problem necessarily. But what your job is to listen and to be there and to empathize. When we are trained as counselors and therapists, the very first basic skills that you learn are how to listen and how to have empathy, because that's how we build that connection with someone, and that's how we gain that trust and allow them to share more of what's going on. So listening, not with the noise in your head that's saying, okay, what am I going to say next? Not listening to respond, but listening to really hear what they're saying, and then validating that and sharing. I hear what you're saying, and I know that that's really stressful for you. I can tell, and I'm really sorry that that's something you're going through. I'm going to be here to support you through it. That just making them understand that having those feelings of worry or fear or frustration or sadness or whatever it is, that's okay. It's okay that they feel that. It's real that they feel that, and you just want to be there to support them through it, and you're going to be along with them, on that journey.
And can I add something here?
Please.
As a psychologist, I can tell you that I've had sessions where people would start talking, and an hour later they stopped and they left. And on the way out the door, they said, "Great session," and they didn't even know I didn't say anything. So people need to be able to talk and get it out. And it is never our job to fix; it's our job to listen. And that is a huge thing, and it's an awesome thing. And the fact is, if people listen, remember looking at yourself when you're feeling really stressed and you want to talk to somebody. Do you want them to interrupt you to tell you that you should try this or should try that? No, none of us want that. So remember, when you're talking to somebody, Your job is to listen. And if people listen, the person that's talking will immediately start to feel better just by getting it off their chest. And never, never assume that you have to fix, because that's a scary thing. If you're listening to somebody and they say something that you think you might be able to interject, trust me, as soon as you think you have something to interject, you're not going to hear another word they say. You're waiting for them to stop talking so you can fix them. And they don't want to be fixed. They want to be heard.
Absolutely. And I have to, tell you that I have the same thing on social media all the time. I'll have people reach out to me or send me an email or, talk to me in person even here. And it's the same thing. It's, oh my goodness, all these things are going on and I'm going to list them all off and say, I don't know what I'm doing and I don't know what to do. And just, they just vent and I say, well, tell me more, and they just get it all out. And then the next day they'll send me a message that says, I can't thank you enough for that conversation. And I tell them, look back at that conversation because that was a one-way conversation. That was me, saying, I'm going to support you through this. I want to hear what you have to say. And I'm going to acknowledge that it's okay that you're having those things go on and that you're having these feelings and things, but I don't give any advice. And like you said, we're not fixing things. They're fixing themselves essentially because they're unleashing something that they've been bottling up for so long. So
talking about it definitely makes you feel better. That's a statement of fact.
Absolutely. Very powerful. But just like with physical health, we cannot be expected to heal a broken leg or, treat a person's cancer or anything like that. So we do have to acknowledge that there are some times when professionals are needed. And so we've got some resources, just for you to understand where to go. As Ted mentioned, if you're in crisis, if you're ever at the time where you suspect that someone's harm is in immediate danger or someone's self is in immediate danger or that someone is planning to harm someone else, that's definitely a time where you want to call 911 or rush someone to the emergency room. But what do you do if you're worried about your own stress or if you're concerned or you're not sure what to do? Hotlines are a great resource. A primary care doctor is also just your number one step. Just hopping in to say, talk to me about this. And I will tell you that a lot of times talking to your primary care doctor, you may go in there talking about some of your aches and pains that you're having. And then that may turn into a conversation about what's going on the farm or in your life. And then that may turn into, maybe you should do this questionnaire and let's just check out where your mental health is. And sometimes it can really uncover a lot more than what you thought. You don't have to go to a primary care doctor, though. You don't need a referral or anything like that to see a therapist. So any type of counselor or social worker or therapist can help you. There is at that findtreatment.samhsa.gov. That's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, if I have that acronym correct. But that's where any behavioral health center is going to be closest to you, so you can quickly find a center if that's something you need to seek out. You can also check with your health insurance for what your in-network providers are. I know that teletherapy is something that right now is starting to roll out, and now during this COVID crisis, we are definitely seeing more options for teletherapy, which is, again, just talking either through Skype or Zoom or some type of virtual or even on the phone, having kind of a therapy session virtually rather than in place. But one thing I think is really, really important to mention when we're talking about resources in therapy is you have to find someone that you can connect with, because I know a lot of times farmers and ranchers feel, again, very misunderstood in society, and therapists don't always understand the complexities that are happening with you and in your life. So I have heard that going to a therapist maybe the first time doesn't really work out so great, and that's okay. The whole goal is just like a dentist or a doctor. You want to find someone who you kind of mesh with and who you feel understood with. So I encourage you definitely to, if the first one isn't working, don't check it off the list. Try it again, because I will tell you, I've had multiple farmers and ranchers talk to me about how therapy completely changed their life. And again, you don't have to go just because you think you have depression or because you're suicidal or anything like that. Therapy is for, any type of goals that you want to set, or it may be just increasing communication on your farm. That's another time where you can see a therapist. So it's really just about self-improvement. And again, going back to that whole concept of mental health, just making your mental health a stronger thing. We talked a little bit about these, the different hotlines that you can call. I will mention that the Farm Aid and Avera and Iowa Concern and the Minnesota Farm and Rural Helpline, these are all just some different sample hotlines that are specific to farming, ranching, rural life. And of course, National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at the top there is a place to call if you're concerned for yourself or others. Finally, as far as resources go, I'm going to let you jump in, Ted, if you have anything else to add after this, but there are all sorts of information out there. I listed here some different training programs. So American Farm Bureau has a new rural resilience program that is all about understanding signs of crisis and how to have these conversations. It just goes into much more detail. There's mental health first aid, or different, farming and non-farming mental health programs that you can learn about. Locally, again, Christian or clergy or any type of religious organization is something to look at. There's support groups, there's alliances, there's all sorts of things. And I think one thing that's kind of interesting is, we have our seed salespeople, we have our, the people we call when we're ready to buy cattle from a certain person and whatever. But someone mentioned once identifying a therapist for your farm. And again, you don't have to wait for a crisis, just having someone's number written down that if anyone on your farm struggles, you just know of a therapist in your area that you can hand that number to. Virtually, there's all sorts of stuff out there. There's podcasts and the different extension offices have all sorts of resources as well. So anything you want to add to that, Ted?
Yeah, in Minnesota, we have farm advocates and farm mediators, extension, farm business management. All of those are really helpful, especially on financial issues and so on. And, never hesitate to call them. And I also wanted to say one more thing about like calling 911. A lot of people are afraid to call 911 because they're afraid that, maybe they shouldn't. That's really, an important emergency line. If you believe that there's an emergency, no one is ever going to tell you that you shouldn't have called that number. So don't be afraid to call 911 if you're concerned about someone.
Absolutely. With that, I think that wraps up the bulk of our presentation here. And I have to, before we go to questions, I just want to mention that you participating in this webinar, viewing this information, being willing to learn more about mental health is really, it's more important than you think, because you kind of join this army of hope growers, right? You join this army of people who are breaking down and normalizing the conversation in mental health. So I just really have to applaud you for being here and for being willing to contribute and learn and reach out and help others as well. Ted, do you have anything to add?
No, thanks. I totally agree with you. Thank you for being there and listening, and hopefully it was helpful, and I wish you well, and definitely in this day and age, I hope you stay healthy.
So Don, I don't know. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say thank you, Ted and Adrian. What a wonderful webinar series. The NCBA Cattlemen's webinar series works to bring you the latest relevant information, and we certainly had the opportunity to hear that tonight. So thank you, both of you, very much. As we move into our question and answer session, I want to remind everyone that while our spring legislative conference was canceled, our team in Washington, D.C. continues to work on your behalf with regulatory agencies, including lobbying strong support for programs like EQIP, which help cost share many of the management practice discussed in this series. As you know, we've also been working around the clock through the COVID-19 crisis to make sure the supply chain stays up and running and advocating for our beef industry. If you are a member of NCBA, we want to thank you very much for your support. If not, please consider joining at ncba.org. We will continue our webinar series focusing on soils, forages, and grazing next week with our final webinar in the series, Optimizing Your Operation, Legumes, Crop Residues, and Cover Crops on Tuesday, March 31st. Registration for that webinar is open at ncba.org, once again under the Producer tab. Now let's get to your questions. Thank you again for participating in the webinar tonight. I'll hand it over to Jesse Fulton, NCBA staff, to moderate the Q&A. Jesse?
Thanks, Don. I'd like to thank everybody that got on with us tonight. My name is Jesse Fulton. I am the Director of Producer Education with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. I'm glad that you all joined us. So let's just jump right into the questions. So Adrian, I'll start with you. How do I convince someone to get help when they're being stubborn, resistant, or just brush it off? How do I get them to recognize that there is a problem and maybe they should see someone?
A really great question, and one that I do get a lot because we know farmers and ranchers sometimes have that stubborn personality, right? I think the first step is in being persistent. And I don't mean asking annoyingly all the time. I mean persistently making sure that that person knows that you are concerned and that you are seeing signs and seeing things that are concerning to you. Maybe just having that conversation allows them to share if there's something that is going on with them, that, you know, maybe they have that irritability, for example, because of something else going on in their life. Maybe it isn't a crisis necessarily, but the thing is that if you continue to show, you know, that compassion for them and that concern for them, that when they are ready to talk, if they need to talk, they know that you're a safe place. They know that you're a person that they can turn to, that they're not going to necessarily be judged by. And that's something I think people are really afraid of. The second piece of that is just, again, you know, think about when you're stressed out. As Ted said earlier, that when you're stressed out or when something's wrong with you, you don't always want to be told what to do. You don't always want to be told, but you need to go get help, right? So we have to just make sure that this is a conversation that isn't about, I think you need help, I think you need to, you know, I'm going to give you this advice, but it's more about, I'm really concerned about you. You know, I'm seeing these things that are happening, and it's making me sad for you, or it's, you know, sharing how it's impacting you. I think a lot of times those conversations start up when we're heated and you need help, or, you know, things aren't right here, and you say things in a tone that maybe you don't necessarily mean. So having a nice, calm conversation, and then just providing those resources. I know that, you know, at Illinois Farm Bureau, for example, has a little card, a little brochure. I know Minnesota has some things like that as well, that, you know, just laying it out, throwing it in their newspaper, so that if they do get to the point where they're ready and willing to get that help, they know who to call, they know who they can go to.
Great. Ted, I'm going to throw this one at you. One of our listeners has noticed that Canada has some free services for counseling, and I believe you do some of that up in Minnesota. Are there any other national programs across the U.S. where there is free counseling service for farmers?
Not that I know of. Minnesota is way ahead in that curve, and you know, because we're not a free agency. It goes through the state of Minnesota, and so the farmer doesn't pay anything for the counseling, but the state of Minnesota has a program where there's a couple of us, plus, as I said earlier, plus we have farm advocates and farm mediators, and extension, and so we have people that are and have been helping Minnesota for a very long time, and as these more difficult times come, we're actually adding people. So I'm very pleased to say Minnesota is front runner in that, and I hope other states start doing that, because you know, as every person that's listening knows, farmers are different. They have different issues. They have different thought patterns, they need to be heard. And oftentimes, as an example, oftentimes the advice people gives is things like, well, if you're not making any money, why don't you quit? Well, say that to a farmer and you're not going to be talking to him anymore. So people need to understand that it's a way of life, as was said earlier. And as a way of life, that's bad advice to be telling people not to be in something when it's a way of life. So,
Ted, to stick with you with that question, what could people across the country, to help to do to get a program like that started? What did they do in Minnesota to really get that started, and what could people across the country do in their state to try to get a program funded, to try to get something similar to what Minnesota's doing?
Well, it's baseline funded, and what that means is it's automatically in the budget for the Department of Agriculture. It's a separate entity. It doesn't go into the DHS, Department of Human Services. It goes through the Department of Agriculture because that's where it belongs. And by going through there and through the legislature, you're working with people who are always working with farmers. And the idea that it isn't free in that I get paid, but it is free to the farmer, because if you charge somebody who doesn't have any money, they can't call you. And the other part of that that's so incredibly important is oftentimes with farmers, they have a 5-minute question, 10-minute question, 20-minute question, and they don't need to come in, and they definitely don't need a diagnosis. They simply have a question. How do I get along with my son better? Or how can I get my wife to hear what I have to say? Or how can I get my husband to hear what I have to say? All those kinds of things can sometimes be addressed in 15, 20 minutes, and go from there. And you can't do that if you have as a clinic. You have to go in, you get diagnosed, you have to have your 45-minute hours. You get to go see them a couple times a month. With programs like this, you can call anytime and have a 5-minute question, and there is no diagnosis, which is another big plus.
All right, thank you. Adrian, I'm going to toss this one over to you. What do I need to do if someone comes to me and they say that they've been having some dark thoughts, or they say they're in a troubled place? What should I do?
We're going to go back to that reaching out, right? That what we talked about, that remember that the answers don't have to lie in you, right? And that's what we get afraid of, is that we have to say the right thing. I think knowing resources are very important. So again, knowing who some therapists are in your area is important. And just know some of those numbers, I guess. But really, what a lot of people need is just that ability to communicate with someone and vent and share those emotions more. So I think that's the first thing we have to do, is just make sure that we're, as people, being genuinely concerned for one another and sharing that concern and listening to that concern, and worrying less about the answers and more about how to listen to those questions. But again, helping them connect with resources, especially if they're using terms like dark thoughts or using terms like suicide, it's important to ask directly, do you have plans to kill yourself? I mean, I know that's hard to say. It is. Even as a counselor, when I had students, it was never an easy question to say as many times as I had to. But it's important to just be very direct about, are there plans? Do you have those intentions? And if the answer is very clearly no, we still want to keep following up and making sure that we're checking in. And if the answer is yes, then again, we can kind of allow a person to talk, but help them connect with their primary care doctor or with therapists in their area.
Okay. Ted, I'm going to come back over to you. How do I make myself better to carrying on the conversation of mental health issues with someone? So, I asked Adrian, someone's come to me and they've said, they're having dark thoughts or something like that. Of course, I'm not trained in it, but how could I make myself better that if they don't want to go talk to a doctor, they only want to talk to a friend, what could I do to better how I communicate with them?
Listen. That's the key. Listen. When people are feeling stressed and they don't trust anybody except you, and they start talking to you, that doesn't mean that by the time they get done, they won't be willing to talk to someone else. And what I also tell people a lot of times is when people are talking about those things, it just, you have to take away that stigma of you're calling a psychologist, and say things like, well, let's call Ted. He knows more about this than I do. And let's just talk to him and see what he thinks about that. And you keep it so it's not pointing fingers that there's something wrong with you, or we really need to. And by keeping it simple like that, it just makes it a lot easier for people.
All right, Adrian. Let's say that I've been around a family friend or a family member, my whole life, and that person has always seemed fine to me. They're not struggling anywhere, but then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you see that they're having mental health changes. You see that things are changing for them. You kind of brought it up earlier. How do I convince myself that there is a legit problem and I need to do something about it?
You don't need to convince yourself. That you don't need to convince yourself. You're just making an observation. And so if that observation is there, that there's no harm in asking and just pointing something out that you've noticed. If there's let's just say, because I know in my experience a lot of times it's that irritability thing, that suddenly there's just a lot of frustration. So let's just use that as an example. You don't have to know if there's something really wrong. You don't have to know if there's depression or anxiety or suicidal thoughts necessarily. All you have to do is show that concern to start off with. You don't have to convince yourself of anything. You just need to be able to go up to that person and say, hey, you know what? I've noticed that you're kind of ticked off recently, right? You say it in your own words. Be genuine. You don't have to read from a script, but just point out what is it that you're noticing that's different. And hopefully just opening that conversation up will allow that person to share if there is something more serious going on, or if there is something that's kind of built up. But I just would challenge you not to worry so much about making the answer right or wrong in your mind. I would challenge you to just confront the situation. It doesn't have to be a big deal, a big show. It's just, let's just talk about it for a second. And maybe you'll learn that it was nothing. And maybe you'll learn that, that asking, that number one, asking about it was life-saving. You just never know.
All right, Ted, I got a question just came in. Do you have any tips on finding inspiration to work harder or smarter when one is feeling down in life, the family or work?
Well, I have lots of them. Truthfully, first thing you have to do is look at the positive things in your life as well as the negative things. I know how easy that is to say. I know everyone says, yeah, you got to be nice, you got to do that. But the fact is, if you forget why you're doing all those things, then bad things will happen. In order to get a lot of things done that you really don't feel like getting done, and because you're lethargic, because things are going south on you, that's where friends and family come in to help you get through that time and do more to feel better about those things. Don't forget ever that if you don't identify those positive things, they don't exist. Never forget that. If you honestly believe that there is no good things there, then there aren't. So be aware of the fact that by doing nice things for yourself and having people do nice things for you, it will make it easier. And as I said earlier, easier does not mean easy, it means easier. And that's where we get our energy from having positive things along with the negative things. Remember, with farming, everything in farming is an educated guess. And both words are incredibly important, because if you guess poorly, that's pretty bad. Now, there's no such thing as dumb farmers anymore. There used to be. You used to be able to have, farmers, if they were willing to put in more hours, they could get away with doing a lot of things that they shouldn't have done. Not anymore. Farmers now are smart. The only ones that are left are smart, and they do the best they can. And sometimes the best they can isn't enough. And then when they have to look at what can they do, they need to be nice about that question. What can I do?
All right, thank you. It looks like I'm down to my last question. Adrian, I'll come over to you. What can we do to make the mental health conversation easier?
This right here. Learning, being willing to learn, being willing to talk. I will tell you just pure honesty about what's really going on in your life sometimes. And I'm not talking about depression. I'm not talking about those things. I'm just talking about when you have a bad day, for example. I do a lot of advocacy online through these So Hope Grow Hope channels. And on Twitter one day, a guy posted about how he just had a really crappy day. And this is a guy who I would never have guessed would say something like that. He's kind of hard-headed, kind of sarcastic. And he just said, you know what? I had a bad day and I had to reach out. And I want you to know that if you have a bad day and you need to reach out, that's okay. And the coolest thing about this was the number of comments and retweets and shares and likes and all that. It just blew up, and what people were saying was, you know what, I had a bad day too. And so people were sharing their truths, they were sharing what was really going on with them. Then you saw people who were sharing things that had worked for them. One guy talked about how he went to AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and that was something that was really game changing for him. So you had people sharing resources. And finally, you had people who weren't necessarily even involved in farming or ranching, or people who were that, have a pretty good handle of their own stress, but they were talking about you just giving support and just saying, validating, yeah, I'm really sorry. That sounds like a really tough day. And so people were willing to just kind of build that army of support around this guy. And it was really cool. So I just think the biggest thing we can do is just be a little more honest. That doesn't mean we all have to be, Eeyores of the world and gloomy doomy and talking about all the bad things that happen, but just being, willing to answer the question, are you okay? If you're not okay that day, it's okay to say, actually, I'm kind of struggling. Just kind of breaking down that and normalizing that idea that our lives aren't perfect.
All right. Well, it looks like that'll do us for questions tonight. We're about out of time. For those attendees that are still on, I highly encourage you to share this recording with anyone that you know that might need to see it. It was a great topic that we covered tonight that we need to be talking more about. I'll make sure that recording is available online first thing in the morning. I'll also make sure we can share it across our social media. That way you can share it there as well. I'd like to thank our speakers, Adrian and Ted, for joining us tonight. I greatly appreciate you all taking time out of your evening. Adrian, I know that you got some little ones that are running around crazy probably right now with your husband. I'm sure he's ready for you to get back in there to help him out. So with that, I'll end the webinar and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much.